Welcome. Hey all, my name is Jill Jonathan and I'm with Red Wine and Blue. We are a community of women who use digital media and friend to friend organizing to change the world one suburb at a time. And one way we're trying to do that is through conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and add my co host, Joe, as in JoJo from her on here. She and I host these conversations together. Sometimes we talk just to each other on Monday mornings for the morning buzz when we talk about news stories. And then sometimes we'll have special guests. So today, Joe and I are going to be talking to Eli Erlick. It looks like she just joined. Welcome, Joe. How are you doing?
Hi.
Today is the day my kids went back to school. So I feel way more relaxed, if I'm being honest. I love it. Okay, it
Although it's
looks
like
like
a mixed
Eli's.
bag, right? Because there's all the emotion attached to that too.
Yeah, and I don't
Mm.
know. Like yesterday, I think they were like antsy and nervous, but like yesterday, I was like, you need to go back. Like, I'm ready. So I don't really have the sadness today, so we'll see. All right, let me see. I think we've got Eli here. So, just a little bit, I said Red, Wine, and Blue is a community of women who use digital media to and organizing to change the world one suburb at a time. There's Eli. Hello, Eli. Oh my
Hi
gosh.
there.
And of course, she's wearing like an awesome blazer again. The last time I interviewed Eli, she was just the most beautiful blazer. So, thank you so much for joining, Eli. And as people are starting to join, I want to let you know that at Red Wine and Blue, we have a limited series podcast called The Cost of Extremism that we have going this August. So Eli was one of our guests on episode 3 that dropped this last Wednesday, and we talked about anti-trans bills and how they're really harming the youth, opposite of what some people are hearing. So we asked Eli if she wanted to join us and we could just, carry on the conversation. So I'm so excited you're here. Welcome. And Eli, this is Joe. So now you
Hi.
two know each other.
Hey, great to meet you.
Great to meet you too. I listened to the episode and you're amazing. I'm so glad to talk to you.
Oh, well, thank you. I just posted the link to this on my social media, so hopefully a few more people are flowing in.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and like I said, it's Cost of Extremism, so please look for it anywhere you get podcasts. Our first episode was about active shooter drills in schools, which is not a great thing, as you can imagine. The second one is about school vouchers, and then next week we'll be talking about school boards. But today we are talking to Eli, and Eli, my first question for you as I listened back to the episode, I'm like, your empathy is amazing. Like, you were talking about one time, you're like, oh, if people did hear that something like this is harming children, then you might be upset by that. And I just feel like the way that you showed empathy for why people might be upset that just don't understand what all of this is, I just thought was incredibly gracious. So my first question is, where does that come from? How do you, how do you have so much grace?
Well, thank you. I mean, honestly, I don't think I do. I mean, part of my work is also working with people on the far right and really understanding that a lot of them come from places of genuine concern, and it takes a lot of deprogramming and work to actually get to the core of their beliefs. I also grew up in a small town. Like we are very often put into our bubbles, especially here on TikTok, where the algorithm knows what we want to see, and we're able to we're able to not really engage with other people who might fall outside of our beliefs. Now, I'm not saying we should platform like fascists or anything, but I am saying sometimes we can talk to them when they're not like actively engaging and trying to kill us. I mean, like, I grew up in this very small town where I was like harassed and bullied every day. And I understand that a lot of that did come through like social reproduction and repeating talking points that they might have heard from their parents or Fox News or whatever they were listening to. So a lot of a lot of the prerogative, unfortunately, does fall on the people that they're harming, where I'm always on the edge of like, it's not up to us to work with communities that are trying to kill us. But at the same time, if we don't, then they're just going to keep on going down that cycle.
And you say, in the interview that and this makes sense, and it is gracious. You say it's easy to believe the first thing you hear if you don't have, a foundation of knowledge, and someone says they're mutilating kids, and these people don't know. And I live in a very red town, and I hear these kinds of things a lot because the disinformation game is so strong. But like you talk about, like that first crazy thing that they hear and they get triggered by it, and the next thing you know, it's like there's all the disinformation that they're open to because there isn't enough information out there to combat it. And I love that what you're doing, because you talked a lot about that too, is going after that disinformation. So I mean, can you talk about that a little bit, the two things there? So there's that idea that they hear this crazy thing and then believe it, and then the disinformation that's part of that too.
Absolutely. Something that the far right really needs to do is get out of their media bubble and have exposure. Now, I also always caution people, especially more moderate liberals, about thinking that this is just about the information ecosystem. It's also about making people care, and also sometimes realizing that not everyone's beliefs can be changed. So really approaching these different issues with like a multifaceted strategy is really crucial here, because they could, I mean, you've seen all of the studies that support trans people, and they'll ignore 100% of them. They won't believe a single one, but they will believe the one study that isn't peer reviewed and was posted on 4chan or Substack or something that says that trans kids are being harmed by our doctors. It's unfortunate that a lot of this takes it takes more than just fixing the information ecosystem, but also truly making people care, have empathy for our communities, and maybe, God forbid, meet a trans person at some point.
I know, God forbid. And you know what I found interesting too, as we chatted, is that this work you've been doing since you were a teenager. So can you just tell us a little bit about the organization you started when I think you were maybe 14 or 15, like pretty young?
So I've been out since 2003 when I was 8, and things have changed a lot since then. As my favorite philosopher Michel Foucault likes to say, visibility is a trap. It's absolutely a double-edged sword, and while now we may have more access, we're also faced with a lot more bullshit. So it's it's definitely shifted how we're treated in unpredictable and sometimes fascinating ways. So I co-founded Trans Student Educational Resources when I was 16 after a couple years of being involved in the community. And it's really been a life-changing process of not just engaging in the community, but also self-growth and really actualizing what different trans kids and trans people's needs are at any given moment. And that's shifted a lot since it was founded in 2011.
Something that came up also in the episode was this idea that it often is pushed by the far right that needs to be debunked, and in coupling with that, with the emotional component to it, is this agenda, right? So like we hear, everyone from Ron DeSantis to Marjorie Taylor Greene saying that there's the trans agenda, and it's just loaded, right, with so much messaging that is dangerous and not at all accurate. And I just could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, as the old joke goes, the trans agenda is bringing trans kids to be happy trans adults and making sure that people are able to access treatment that they need. So in that sense, yeah, sure, there's an agenda. It's making people happier and healthier in society, which I guess is a bad thing these days. So it's been very difficult dealing with this newfound rhetoric of like us forcing transition on kids, which every single study has found isn't the case. And also like trying to overtake women's sports or whatever they're pulling out of the hat these days. It's all very ridiculous. None of it is empirical, and it's very I mean, it's very much pull tested and based on the emotions of their base. I mean, something I'd like to point out is that they did actually pull test what conservative voters would prefer to see. The Heritage Foundation and several other far-right think tanks ran different polls on potential voters and found that attacking trans youth healthcare specifically really resonated with them because they weren't familiar with trans youth issues or, trans youth at large. And so they started there and they found that to be a very galvanizing point. And as we've seen, they've expanded. Now they're trying to ban trans healthcare altogether. They're trying to take away medical access. And they're trying to remove us from, basic teaching positions. It's getting more and more, and it is literally a slippery slope. And we've seen that backfiring on them. While conservative voters were able to understand attacking trans youth healthcare because they don't understand trans youth, they're losing some of their base on their rampant attacks on just trans existence, period.
Where do you think this is coming from? Is it for votes? Is that votes power? Like, do they actually care about what's going on? Like, how can you if you don't really understand it?
That's a great question. And I think we have been, we went over this briefly on the podcast too. I always hesitate to even ask that question. Do they care? Like, does it matter? The results are the same. They are trying to get conservative foundation money, which we've seen. There was a report coming from the UN that found hundreds of millions of dollars, primarily from evangelical and Catholic organizations, are funding these operations, and people are getting very rich off of them too. But at the same time, doesn't matter because the results are the same. They're not based in evidence, empirical facts, or, trans people's lived experiences, and they're entirely based on trying to appeal to this very powerful minority base.
And what? Oh, go ahead, Joe. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to ask, sort of attached to that, none of it's based in truth or fact or reality, what just took place in the state of North Carolina last night. 3 bills were passed, one of them essentially banning gender-affirming care for minors unless, they'd already had, and then even still that there are restrictions on it. There's another one banning trans girls from playing sports. 2, I think, there was the statistic, 2 trans girls have played high school sports in North Carolina, like, since they've been recording this. And then there's a Don't Say Gay bill for K through 4th grade, even though it's blocking gender identity or sexual orientation being taught, even though those things are not being taught to K through 4th grade students. So there's this fear-mongering to build an argument for creating outrage. It's all this like layers of manufacturing outrage on top of more manufactured outrage, and none of it is based in truth. They're just scaring people with things that aren't even happening, and then in so doing justifying laws like these.
Yeah, it's very difficult. Another report that was released recently from Florida found that 7 anti-trans doctors were paid over $300,000 to fly into the state, provide false testimony and reports that there just wasn't enough research on trans healthcare or that trans healthcare negatively affected patients. So these sort of this sort of revolving door of trans healthcare and attacks on it it's been difficult to combat because, like you said, truth doesn't matter. They can find some doctors willing to take tens of thousands of dollars to report whatever they want them to report. And that's one of the major difficulties here, that truth, science, facts, personal experiences, they don't matter as long as it doesn't match the ideology of the holder. And to some degree, that also happens on the left. But what's going on with attacks on trans youth right now, we're seeing something that hasn't happened in decades. So what's going on with North Carolina is, I mean, we're seeing them trying to compete with Florida in these sort of anti-trans bills. And thankfully, these typically don't pass. We are, I mean, there hasn't been a single trans healthcare ban that's been upheld in courts. So we're going to see that struck down. The education is going to be most likely struck down, although, like you said, it's kind of a moot point. We're not teaching queer and trans kids who are, or about queer and trans issues to kids who are like 5 or 10, although frankly we should be. And it's really just a segue into garnering votes, power, and money for these politicians.
So I want to talk about the truth. And this is the thing that really stuck with me talking to you. And we also talked to Alejandro Caraballo. And both of you were saying, you know, gender affirming care, especially under 18, like as you get younger, is growing your hair out, changing your hair, changing your pronouns, maybe changing your name. And then as you get a little older, maybe trying out puberty blockers and different things like that. So can you just tell us, like, what is the truth? Like, what do people really need to know about, you know, youth and gender affirming care?
Well, a lot, that's for sure. I mean,
You're like, how much time do you have?
yeah, right. I mean, I was one of those youth. Like, I began transitioning socially when I was 8 and medically when I was 14, 15. And there's a lot of debate, even within the trans community, of what ages this should be at, what's an appropriate time frame. And I think there are valid debates to be had there. Like, at what age should hormones be started? Some argue at the beginning of puberty, others argue it should be 12 to 14. There's also a lot of myths that get perpetuated in the trans community too. There's like the idea that nobody under 18 gets surgery, which again, I was also one of those people who did. And it's, I mean, that myth gets perpetuated in our own community for a reason, that like there are very few trans teens who are getting surgery. And obviously, like, nobody, like no 5-year-old is getting surgery, which Fox News seems to be pushing right now, which is a little ridiculous. The only actual children who are being operated on are intersex kids who are being forced into a gender role that may or may not fit them without their consent, as usually babies or like toddlers. And most trans people I know are very much against that. So there's a lot of work to do on educating the public on what's appropriate. I think it's also important to point out that trans youth rates of regret are actually lower than trans adults. And if you had literally anything else that had a 98, 99% satisfaction rate, it would be called a miracle. But because it's trans healthcare, because most people don't understand it, it's not.
I wanted to talk about the sort of human component, going back to how do we get people to care, you know, while we're hopefully also debunking disinformation and educating them on the truth. Let's talk about what denying our trans youth the health care that they need does to them. You know, one of the people that Jill interviewed in the podcast was the parent of a transgender girl, and she talks about, you know, what having access to healthcare, having supportive parents, etc., what it's meant for her daughter. And I just want to talk about that. If we could get people to care, you know, what would the cost? What is the cost? The emotional toll on someone who's trans and young and doesn't have access to healthcare.
It can be huge. It can absolutely be, I mean, it's life-saving care. Every peer-reviewed study on trans youth has found that. And everyone's different too. Not all trans youth medically transition, not all trans people medically transition. I know for me, it was a life or death situation. I wouldn't be here without trans healthcare. And you'll hear that from so many trans people. I mean, being able to pause puberty or go through the right puberty is really fantastic. It's something that we should be celebrating and not even having to defend.
You know, I interviewed a doctor a few months ago who does offer gender affirming care. And one, he asked to be anonymous. And I'm like, we got to think about that for a second. And when a doctor's like, I need to be anonymous because of my safety, which, you know, I always sit with that when I think about that. But he was telling me that in the state, some of these anti-trans bills that are people are trying to pass, that there are his ICU unit was preparing for that, for an influx of suicide attempts. And that just stuck with me. I mean, I'm like, that is so haunting. So I'm just curious if you can just talk about that a little bit, about suicide and anti-trans bills and legislation and the correlation between those.
Absolutely. I mean, another big part of this attack on trans youth in trans people in general is changing the voting base. I mean, I know so many people who have moved out of Florida, and DeSantis has done one thing in guaranteeing himself another however many years of governorship because people don't want to live there anymore, especially people who might have queer and trans family members. So it also has that practical effect. People who can hide that they're trans will probably be more likely to do so now. And it's, I mean, it's really disheartening. I know so many people who have killed themselves in the last 2 years alone because of these attacks. And it's really hurting a lot of people, a lot of trans folks, and especially a lot of trans kids.
How do we get that message out there more? You know, I know we're talking about it. There's a podcast that is amazing, done by Red, White, and Blue, and Jill hosted it, where you're talking about it. But how do we convey what you just said to, you know, the masses? Because you said also, I think in the interview, the majority of Americans actually don't support these attacks. You know, so how do we make that connection and get that out there?
Well, I found the number one way to have people understand is listening to trans youth. I think that listening is really the central component here. And by listening, I mean active listening, actually going forward and supporting trans people, not just hearing them disagreeing with us. It's difficult too because with our insular media ecosystem, there's a lot of trouble really getting trans youth, trans people platformed in a way that's not utterly destructive. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the most popular types of far-right media right now is platforming trans people out of context and trying to demonize us with it, or calling us ugly and asking if you want this ugly person teaching their children. It's very silly and juvenile, but it's also effective. I mean, the politics of far-right attacks it's destructive, and there's not really a major a progressive political party in the US right now. So the Republicans are playing 3D chess while Democrats are playing checkers. And it's become very difficult to actually institutionalize any sort of support for trans people.
I want to, Joe, unless you have another question, I want to switch to a lighter, I don't know if it's a lighter topic or not, but Eli, I looked at your TikTok and I just want you to talk about some of these vintage photos that you have been sharing. Can you just explain to us what that is and why you're sharing that and why it's important?
Absolutely. So right now I'm writing a book on underreported trans history. I'm hoping it'll be out next year. Very excited for it. And how I really got into that was finding old photos of trans people from usually 1800s to mid 1900s. And we've been around. We've actually been much more of the population than we're given credit for. Trans people were, in fact, not invented by the Jewish mafia in 2015 or whatever Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying these days. So it's been very heartening. And I think something very important that's come out of this research is just how well we were treated, particularly in the early 1900s. Like, don't get me wrong, trans people didn't have a lot of very basic rights that we do today, like dressing how we want. But some media, especially for people who medically transitioned, was overwhelmingly positive. The couple of brothers who really started this project, Mark and David Farrow, they were two twin brothers who transitioned in their early teens in the 1930s. They medically transitioned at 15 and 17 in Great Yarmouth in the UK, which is like the small port town. And they were widely celebrated. And you're seeing these far-right newspapers, well, far-right today, like the Daily Mirror and other like national British tabloids saying how brave they were and how incredible it is that we have this medical breakthrough. Language was a little clunky and it was very dated. Like they had no idea what the word trans wasn't popularized until the 80s. So they didn't really know what was going on. But they were very celebratory. And I think that's something really amazing. I mean, these two brothers, like their entire community supported them, their parents, their three siblings, everyone supported who they are. They, they were called by the right pronouns, they married, had great lives, and died at fairly old ages. And I think that's incredible. And I've been finding so many of those stories that haven't been reported on in like 50, 100 years whatsoever. So there's just an incredible amount of trans history that still needs to be mined and publicized.
Yeah, and it does show you also, the impact of the disinformation machine and of the messaging, to vilify people because there's a lack of education and understanding. And when that isn't happening as much anyway, you can see, like you said, the correlation there with letting these people live their genuine lives and celebrating their bravery, which it is bravery to walk around in your own skin and know this is who you are when a lot of the country right now is sounding some fake alarm about, how what you're doing is wrong. So it is incredibly interesting to make that correlation. And I just want to follow back up with one other question. I asked this of Alejandra as well. Like, what would you say to someone, a young person or anyone out there right now who with all of this going on is afraid? Like they're afraid to take those steps to walk in their own skin. What would you say to them right now?
A lot. I mean, I study the history of social movements. I am very interested in how they evolve. And what we're seeing right now is a blip. Like they'll move on to the next category they want to attack in probably a few months, 2 years at the most. Right now, this is gearing up for the midterms and trying to come up with an identity for the Republican Party. So they will get over it and they'll find someone else to pick on eventually. And hopefully, if anything, this is going to move more people to understand that nationalism, fascism, and bigotry aren't effective political tools, and we need to continuously align ourselves with more and more progressive causes. So I think ultimately they are doing a favor for younger generations who are going to realize that these politics attacking an entire category of people are unviable and we need to actively fight against them.
Yeah, and then just to follow up with that, what are things that we can do? Like Joe and me, like we're suburban moms, like working and raising kids, and like what can just people like us that we don't, well, I can't speak for you, Joe, but like I'm not immersed in the trans community, but what can I do from my little sphere of influence that I have?
Well, definitely. I mean, donating is always the biggest thing that I say. Trans people are constantly having to fund their own healthcare, and that's a huge one. I mean, sometimes I'll even just like pay $10 for the copay for a friend's like estrogen. And that helps a lot. Then along with that, as people with platforms, like giving platforms to trans folks and keeping up with what's happening. Going to protests is always very important, and also sharing these pieces of trans experience and trans history.
Yeah, that's great. Joe, do you have anything else?
No, I just really appreciate you. I appreciate your voice. I appreciate your work. I appreciate your time, and I empathize with what you have to deal with, and I will do whatever it takes to play my part in changing this narrative so that we can move forward and not backwards.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
exactly. And Eli, when do you have an idea of when your book will be coming out? Or is it too early to say?
I'm hoping at some point in 2024 we'll find out. You know how
Yeah.
presses are; they always drag their feet.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm assuming like if we follow you on social media, which I do, we'll be able to keep in touch with that. So, obviously
Absolutely.
you're on TikTok. Is there anywhere else that people can find you?
Well, my main platforms are Instagram and regrettably still Twitter for some reason.
Same.
Yeah, it was like, yeah, we get it.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Okay.
But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Joe and I are with Red, Wine, and Blue, and we have the podcast is called The Cost of Extremism, and you can hear more of Eli's story. So just look for that on anywhere you get your podcast. That episode became live on Wednesday, so you can listen to that. And Eli, so great to chat with you, and we will definitely keep in touch with you.
Thanks.
Thank
Great,
All
you.
right.
great
Thanks,
chatting.
everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
Eli.